The UFC returns to Abu Dhabi this upcoming weekend for the first of two events in 2025 because we just learned from Uncle Dana on his Instagram this past week that Tom Aspinall versus Ciryl Gane will headline the pay-per-view in October at the Etihad Arena on October 25th. But first we will see a fight night in Abu Dhabi at the Etihad Arena headlined between the former middleweight champion Robert Whittaker looking to bounce back from his loss to Khamzat Chimaev, and he will be taking on the surging Reinier de Ridder, who is undefeated in the UFC and looking to become a UFC champion to add to his mantle at home that already has multiple championships from multiple weight classes from one championship. All of the things that Robert Whittaker has accomplished, being a middleweight champion, all of the names and high-profile fights that he has had on his resume so far, and somehow he is still just 34 years old. In many ways, he reminds me a lot of Max Holloway, who just competed this past weekend with a big win over Dustin Poirier in New Orleans. Because Robert is technically still in that fighting prime in terms of age, but if you look at the fight years, he has been through the ringer against some of the best fighters this middleweight division has ever seen. That includes multiple fights with Israel Adesanya, the all-time great. Multiple fights with Yoel Romero, the Olympic silver medalist turned title challenger in the UFC multiple times. Kelvin Gastelum, a former interim title challenger. Marvin Vettori, a former title challenger. Paulo Costa, a former title challenger. Are you seeing the trend here? And over the past 6 years, dating back to October of 2019, we have only seen Robert Whittaker lose 4 times, and they are all to the best middleweights in the world. 2 of them to Israel Adesanya, both with championships on the line. Another to Dricus du Plessis, who after that fight and finishing Robert Whittaker would go on to challenge for the championship and become the champion. And at UFC 308, as we previously alluded to, his loss to Khamzat Chimaev, where Chimaev would run through him like a hot knife through butter en route to the first round submission just 3 minutes and 34 seconds in. So now Bobby Knuckles is looking to bounce back from that very tough loss to Khamzat Chimaev, who, oh, by the way, since I guess I didn't mention it a second ago, is getting ready to fight for the middleweight championship in less than a month's time at UFC 319 on August 16th in Chicago. And before that fight with Khamzat, where if Whittaker would have won, he would have been on a 3-fight win streak and more than likely been fighting Dricus next month. He had beaten Ikram Aliskerov on a short notice replacement bout via first round knockout in 1 minute and 49 seconds and earned a decision win over Paulo Costa at UFC 298. And 2024 proved to be a pretty pivotal point in Robert Whittaker's career because that was the first time that he had fought 3 times in the same calendar year since 2014, a decade ago, where he would also go 2-1. So now coming into this one at 26 wins and 8 losses to his name and off of a loss to Khamzat Chimaev, it feels as though a lot of things are against Robert Whittaker and that are forcing his hand, and should he lose here, he will be out of title contention for good potentially. And part of that is because he has already lost to the next title challenger. He has already lost to the current champion. And his most recent ranked win was to Paulo Costa, who, yes, just got a victory last week, but is still sitting at number 11 in the middleweight ranks, a fight or 2 away from re-entering title contention. And for the second time in 3 fights, Robert Whittaker is granting a huge opportunity to a much lesser known name. Last June, it was Ikram Aliskerov on short notice, who didn't even have a number next to his name in the middleweight rankings. And now this Saturday, it's Reinier de Ridder, who finds himself at number 13. However, Reinier has a lot more going for him outside of the UFC than what Ikram did, because he was known for his only ever loss being to Khamzat Chimaev, whereas RDR was a 2-weight world champion and one of the biggest promotions in the world, one championship. And when he made his debut in November of 2024, it was a very high-profile signing for the UFC in terms of free agents, and he made good on the debut with a 3rd-round finish over Gerald Meerschaert via submission, which is what RDR is known for, his slick skills down on the mat. But that fight was very sloppy, very kind of weird. Considering Gerald Meerschaert isn't necessarily a world beater in this 185-pound weight class, it seemed as though maybe Reinier de Ridder had already met his ceiling in the UFC after just 1 fight. But since then, he has put all the doubt to bed because he dismantled Kevin Holland in just 3 minutes and 31 seconds in January of this year at UFC 311 before submitting him with a rear naked choke, and then he would absolutely bully Bo Nickel in May in Iowa before stopping him via TKO in the 2nd round that started with a nasty knee to the body. Reinier's also 34 years old, the same as Bobby Knuckles. He is 20-2, having finished 18 of those 20 wins, with 13 of them by way of submission, and been finished in both of his losses by way of knockout. He is an electric fighter that is always in fun fights. This is a very interesting stylistic clash, to be quite frank with you, because Reinier de Ridder is no slouch on the feet, but he's also very sloppy and not necessarily known for his hands, whereas Robert Whittaker has some of the cleanest kickboxing that there is at 185. Honestly, I feel like RDR has a ton of similarities to the middleweight champion that is currently Dricus du Plessis. It must be a three initial thing. DDP, RDR. There's just something about Reinier. He doesn't have this like aura around him or present danger initially when the fight begins, but he just is able to wear on his opponents and drag them to where he wants them to be, more often than not in the realm of his grappling. But to even pick apart and do what he did to Bo Nickel, yes, Bo Nickel isn't some world-class striker, but he still just tore him to pieces. And he even out-wrestled and out-grappled Bo in that fight. It's clear that Reinier is a legitimate threat and an elite fighter at 185 pounds, but even still, just from an on-paper perspective against Robert Whittaker, I don't see a world where he could win, but I said the same exact thing about Dricus du Plessis, and Dricus destroyed Robert Whittaker en route to a second-round stoppage. I'll be very curious to see if Bobby Knuckles is able to keep the fight standing, and if so, can he keep the fight at range, not allowing Reinier to close the distance, get into that phone booth dirty boxing, and even the brutal knees and the clinch that he did to Bo Nickel up against the cage. And if Reinier does get Robert Whittaker down, what are we going to see? Because Khamzat Chimaev made it look easy, and while I'm not saying Reinier can wrestle and grapple like Khamzat, he does technically have way more submission skills and threats than Khamzat Chimaev does. My brain is all over the place with this fight. I am super intrigued to see how Robert Whittaker can potentially bounce back from that nasty loss to Khamzat, how Reinier de Ridder will truly look against an elite level competitor in the middleweight division that has been a champion before, because if he can compete and if he can get a victory, he literally launches himself from number 13 directly into title contention, and don't be surprised if he even gets the winner of that UFC 319 fight next. I would love to get your thoughts on this middleweight main event down in the comments below. What are your predictions? Do you think that Robert Whittaker can bounce back from that loss to Chimaev, keep the fight on the feet, and pick apart Reinier de Ridder with his slick striking? Or will RDR be able to make it nasty, dirty, and make it a brawl en route to maybe getting a finish on the feet like he did against Bo Nickel, or drag Robert Whittaker down to his realm in the mat and get a submission? I feel like this fight can go 16 different ways, and if you've got 16 different outcomes and bets, be sure to let me know down below. And outside of that middleweight main event, there are actually a ton of other very fun fights on this card that hold a lot of significance for their respective divisions, and none more important potentially than the co-main event in the bantamweight division between the former champion and currently ranked number 3 Petr Yan and the number 13 ranked undefeated in the UFC, Marcus McGhee. Petr Yan's career thus far in the UFC can kind of be described in 3 separate chapters. There was the debut and rise to becoming the undefeated in the UFC bantamweight champion that included wins over John Dodson, Jimmy Rivera, Uriah Faber, and a dismantling of the legend that was Jose Aldo to become the champ. Then we have his actual championship reign and number 1 contendership era, where he had the fight with Aljamain Sterling where he would lose via disqualification. Sterling would become the new champion. Then he would face Corey Sandhagen for the interim title and get a victory in my favorite fight of 2021. Then he would rematch Aljamain Sterling and lose, this time legitimately and pretty convincingly for the side of Aljamain Sterling, and follow up that title fight loss with 2 consecutive more losses in number 1 contender style of fights with Sean O'Malley and Merab Dvalishvili, both of whom would go on to become UFC champion. Sean after beating Petr Yan, and Merab with just 1 or 2 more fights after before he would become the champion, and still is to this day. And now we are in the 3rd chapter of Petr Yan's UFC career, and that is the run back toward title contention and getting the strap wrapped around his waist once again. And so far during this chapter, he's 2-0 with 2 wins over Song Yadong and Davison Figueiredo, both very convincing. And doesn't this fight feel eerily similar to that fight in October of 2022 where Petr Yan was ranked in the top 3 of bantamweight and gave someone way back in the rankings a shot to crack into title contention? It was Sean O'Malley 3 years ago, and 3 years later, it's training partner of Sean O'Malley, Marcus McGhee. And while I'm not comparing Marcus McGhee's stardom to Sean O'Malley, because not many people currently in the UFC have that much star power, Marcus McGhee is 4-0 in the UFC. He's 10-1 overall with 9 of his 10 wins by way of finish, and he's right on the end of those prime years at 35, carrying a ton of momentum and off of a victory against Jonathan Martinez, and prior to that, 3 UFC stoppages over Gaston Bolaños, JP Buys, and Journey Newson in his UFC debut. And I made the case for Petr Yan that after this 2-0 stretch against Figueiredo and Song Yadong that he earned his shot back into title contention and for a rematch against Merab, this time for a title, but instead it was never awarded to him. It was Umar who would get it after beating Corey Sandhagen, and then it was Sean O'Malley getting an immediate rematch, at least not for Merab, but for Sean's sake. And even still, Petr Yan is not getting the title shot because instead it is Corey Sandhagen who is coming off of the same victory, Davison Figueiredo, except he did it more convincingly with a second round finish. And that fight will be the co-main event of the UFC 320 card on October 4th in Las Vegas, Nevada. Dana White just told us that a couple of days ago. So instead of remaining on the sidelines, Petr Yan is putting himself right back into action, and he's giving someone with a lot less name value and way back in the rankings an opportunity to crash in and screw up all of the bantamweight ranks and the run that Petr Yan is currently on. And for this one, I have a hard time envisioning a world where Marcus McGhee can get a victory over someone as elite as Petr Yan. And that's coming from someone who loves Marcus McGhee and has even cashed numerous bets on Marcus McGhee. I love watching this guy. He has a great story, he's a great family man, he's extremely humble and respectful toward his opponents and toward the fight game. And he has a very fun fight style, again, having finished 9 out of his 10 victories and been submitted in his lone loss. He has a kill or be killed style of fighter, but after his most recent outing against Jonathan Martinez, where he did get the victory, albeit not as easy as the first 3 fights in the UFC, you saw that when he took that step up in competition, things got not just harder as you would expect, but significantly harder. And now going from Martinez to Petr Yan just feels like much too big of a jump, at least too soon. But maybe McGhee can prove me and some of the other doubters wrong, get the biggest win of his career, and absolutely catapult himself into title contention. If he beats Petr Yan, you bet your ass he will get the winner of Corey Sandhagen versus Merab Dvalishvili going down at the beginning of October. And the way Merab is, should he beat Corey Sandhagen, he's probably going to want to have the fight before the end of 2025. So Marcus, if you win this one, get ready. And for Petr Yan, if you fend off Marcus and win your 3rd straight, you better stay ready as well to fight at the end of the year. Shara Bullet returns in the featured bout for his first fight since February, which was his first professional loss ever, and it was at the hands of the longtime Bellator veteran turned very entertaining UFC fighter thus far, Michael Venom Page, where MVP would control that fight from start to finish, not allowing Shara Magomedov to really get anything going. And before that, the bullet that is Shara Magomedov was on a rocket ship to the moon in terms of star power and title shots and everything in between for the UFC, because he was 4-0 with 2 highlight reel knockouts and 2 very fun and exciting decision wins as well. And for Shara's sake, he is still just 31 years old, so he's right in those prime years. 15-1 still all in all, having finished 12 of his 15 wins by way of knockout, and it feels like the UFC is allowing him to have a big get-right moment in this one because he's taking on the veteran Marc-Andre Barriault. The 35-year-old Barriault has lost 3 of his last 4 bouts, with 2 of those 3 by way of first-round knockout against Dustin Stoltzfus and Joe Pyfer. However, he has rebounded from that losing skid in his most recent bout at UFC 315 in May, where he would get a victory and finish over Bruno Silva in the first round by way of knockout in his own right. This would be a big-time upset and a huge win for the power bar Marc-Andre Barriault to shut down someone like Shara Magomedov, and that would really ruin all potential hype that was left for the last Pirate in my opinion. However, I do feel that is a big-time uphill battle for MAB and an opportunity for Shara to shine in Abu Dhabi. The number 9 ranked flyweight in the world, Asu Almabayev, is returning from his first UFC loss to Manel Kape that happened in March in a main event in the Apex in Vegas, and he's taking on short notice replacement Jose Ochoa, who is 1-1 so far in the UFC. Asu Almabayev made his UFC debut in August of 2023 and started 4-0, all 4 of them against very notable names in the flyweight division: Ode Osborne, CJ Vergara, Jose Johnson, and Matheus Nicolau, that would allow him to enter the top 15 of the division. However, he did falter in his biggest moment against his highest name competition in Manel Kape, and pretty convincingly, as Manel would earn the 3rd round TKO finish in that one with strikes. But we can't deny that the 31-year-old out of Kazakhstan, Asu Almabayev, is a very legitimate threat in this flyweight division, and someone that with a victory here is very much in the realm of title contention with just 1 more victory. And for the 24-year-old out of Peru, that is Jose Ochoa, he is 8-1 with a 100% finish rate, and coming off of his first UFC victory that was against Cody Durden via 2nd round knockout at UFC Atlanta a little over 1 month ago. So a very quick turnaround, a short notice fight against a very dangerous opponent in Asu Almabayev, and yet the odds, at least when I looked on Monday, were damn near a pick 'em him, and that just doesn't make sense to me, considering that Ochoa's debut fight in the UFC was a loss to Reinier Kavanaugh. And that's no disrespect to Kavanaugh by any means, but when you compare those two fights to what Almabayev has done in his first 5 UFC fights, it just doesn't compare, it doesn't line up to me, but maybe Ochoa can prove me wrong and put a pie in my damn face. We've got a very fun fight between 2 top 15 fighters in the light heavyweight division that is sure not to go the full 15 and may not even last the first 5, and that is the number 10 ranked Nikita Krylov and the number 13 ranked Bogdan Guskov. Nikita Krylov has been in the UFC for 11 and a half years, dating back to January of 2014, yet he is still just 33 years old, meaning he made his UFC debut at the age of 21 or 22, and has faced a lot of big names over the last decade plus. That spans 2 separate UFC stints, mind you, because the first one was 2014 to 2016, then he would take 4 fights outside of the UFC, going 4-0 with 4 finishes before returning to the promotion in 2018, and he's been with them ever since. And prior to his loss in 2025 at UFC 314, where he would be knocked out by Dominic Reyes, who is having a career resurgence right now, Nikita was on a 3-fight win streak with 2 finishes. The finishes over Ryan Spann and Alexander Gustafsson, and in between was a decision win over Volkan Oezdemir, the former title challenger. He has had 40 professional fights already at 33 years old and has only gone the distance 4 times, with 28 out of 30 wins by way of stoppage, 16 submissions and 12 knockouts, and 8 of his 10 losses by way of stoppage with 6 submissions and 2 knockout losses. And for his opponent Bogdan Guskov, the relatively new UFC fighter who is 3-1 in the promotion thus far, he is 17-3, so out of those 20 fights, he's only seen the scorecards once, and that was over the course of a loss. He's got 14 knockouts and 3 submissions, and been finished in 2 of his 3 losses with 1 knockout and 1 submission respectively, and he is 32 years old, right in his prime. Both of them, in terms of at least age, are in their primes, but fighting age, the way that they go, they've taken some damage. Guskov made his UFC debut against Volkan Oezdemir, where he would lose via first-round submission, but hasn't looked back since, with 3 consecutive victories, all 3 of them by way of stoppage, obviously, because of the 100% finish rate, and they were Zach Palga, Ryan Spann, and Billy Elikana, the UFC newcomer, and that was most recently at UFC 311 in January. Don't blink in this fight, because someone is going to sleep. Now, whether that be from a knockout or a submission, that's what we're going to find out on Saturday afternoon. We've got a new addition to the bantamweight division, as if it needed anything else because of how stacked it is right now, and that is Bryce Thug Nasty Mitchell, the former top 15, maybe even at one point top 10 featherweight, turned newcomer to 135. And Bryce is coming down to 135 pounds after losing 3 of his last 5 bouts, all 3 of those losses by way of stoppage, and the 2 wins were to Kron Gracie via knockout due to a slam, and a decision over Dan 50K Ige, who just fought this past weekend. And granted, those losses, by the way, that he lost via stoppage was to Ilia Topuria, who would then go on to become the featherweight champion, and has since became the lightweight champion and number 1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world. One of the most vicious knockout losses you'll ever see to Josh Emmett, a former interim title challenger, in December of 2023, and his most recent fight was at UFC 314 in April, where he would be destroyed by Jean Lord Silva, who would ultimately get the submission win in the second round after beating up Bryce on the feet. But for Bryce, he is still just 30 years old, so this move down to 135 is happening right in the middle of his prime. He was never that big of a featherweight to begin with, so maybe this can be a fresh start for the still 17-3 fighter, mind you. But I wouldn't necessarily say that it's an easy debut into the weight class, because Said Nurmagomedov is 33 years old, so in his prime as well, and is 18-4 overall. He started his UFC career 6-1 between July of 2018 and December of 2022, but since then has lost 2 of his last 3 bouts and has not been the most active fighter on the roster by any means. His most recent fight was to Vinicius Oliveira, who is still undefeated in the UFC after beating Kyler Phillips last weekend, and that was a decision loss in February. And his other most recent loss was to Jonathan Martinez in March of 2023, and sandwiched in between was a victory against Muin Gafurov in October of 2023, so he didn't even fight at all in 2024, and maybe that lack of activity could hinder him against someone in Bryce Mitchell, who has been very active over the last few years. And although his last name is Said Nurmagomedov and he hails from Russia, he's not necessarily known for his grappling and wrestling like some of the other Dagestani-style fighters. He instead is a very long, rangy fighter that utilizes some very interesting striking techniques. And of course, we know that Bryce Mitchell's realm is on the mat with his submissions and top control, and if he can't get Said down, I think it's going to be a very interesting bout on the feet, because Bryce has showed some skills there for sure, but is it enough to beat someone like Said over the course of a 15-minute kickboxing match? I don't think so. And last but not least is a bout in the strawweight division between the number 7 ranked Amanda Ribas and the number 10 ranked Tabatha Baby Shark Ricci. I am definitely a part of the Amanda Ribas fan club and have been ever since her debut numerous years ago, I believe, 2019 at this point. She started her UFC career 4-0 with tons of hype and momentum, especially after beating Paige Van Zant on Fight Island at UFC 251 in 2020. But ever since then, it hasn't been as easy for Amanda Ribas, who has traded wins and losses back and forth and bounced back and forth between 115 and 125. From January of 2021 to January of 2025, the last 4 years for Ribas' career, she's had 8 fights over the course of that span, having just won 3 of them. She has gone 2-2 in the strawweight division, which is where the fight is taking place this weekend, and 1-3 in the flyweight division at 125 pounds. And truly, I feel like Amanda does belong at 115, at least at this point in her career, because she is still just 31 years old, in her prime, and as silly as it may sound, I'm still a big believer in her skill set and her ceiling and potential. But that could really take a hit should she lose to Tabatha Ricci this weekend, because it will set her outside of the top 10 and a very long ways away from title contention. And for the Baby Shark, she will enter this after losing her most recent fight in her biggest step up in competition to date against Yan Xiaonan, the former champion, and that came in November of last year in China. Prior to that, Baby Shark had beaten Angela Hill and Tisha Pennington, and her only other losses in the UFC were to Lupi Godinez via split decision and her debut in the UFC, which was at 125 pounds against Manon Fior, who would go on to, of course, challenge for the title against Valentina earlier this year. This one is very interesting to me from an X's and O's perspective because on the feet, Amanda Ribas will definitely be able to win this fight, and on the ground, you would think that she also has plenty of skill sets to compete with Tabatha Ricci's top game in wrestling. So I'm leaning toward my girl, Amanda Ribas. I hope that she wins selfishly, but if Tabatha Ricci wins, it will definitely be the biggest of her career, and she will be able to insert herself into the top 10 of the strawweight division that isn't necessarily struggling right now, but does need some fresh blood into that title picture. And for both of these women, that's the case because they've been right around the top 10 but never reached that next step because Tabatha Ricci faltered in that biggest moment and so did Amanda Ribas, so now they get another opportunity to do so, but it's against one another first. So that is it for the UFC Abu Dhabi breakdown, and I want to get all of your thoughts and your predictions down in the comments below on that main event and on all of these other big time fights throughout many divisions featuring numerous ranked fighters. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, please be sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new because we are currently on the road to reaching 1,000 subscribers before the end of 2025 and any and all support is greatly appreciated. On top of breakdowns and previews every week, I also recap the most meaningful results from every card and I give my thoughts and opinions on MMA news and fight announcements, which we just had a shit ton of a couple of days ago from Uncle Dana. You can also join the discussion on social media at Verbal Spar MMA on X, Instagram, and TikTok, as well as like the Facebook page Verbal Sparring MMA, and you can follow on your favorite audio listening platforms such as Spotify and Apple, where every Monday and Friday podcast episodes release there. Have a great weekend, enjoy the fights, and I will see you all in the next video.